On the morning of January 14, 2018, a 17-year-old girl climbed through a window. That is the whole story, in one sentence. A 17-year-old girl, small for her age, malnourished, so weak she could barely walk, climbed through a window of a house in Perris, California, and ran. She had been planning this moment for 2 years. She had rehearsed it in her mind every night in the dark, lying on a dirty mattress, listening to her brothers and sisters breathe around her. She was carrying a deactivated cell phone she had found in the house. She did not know if it would work. She did not know where she was going. She did not know what the world outside those walls looked like, because she had barely seen it in years. She ran down the street in the cold California night and found a neighbor's house and knocked on the door. What she told the woman who answered would bring law enforcement, Child Protective Services, and the national media to a quiet cul-de-sac in Riverside County within hours. And what they found inside that house would leave every single person who walked through the door unable to sleep properly for weeks. This is the story of David and Louise Turpin, and 13 children who grew up believing that the world outside their front door did not exist for them. To understand how something like this happens, you have to start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the abuse, the beginning of the family. Because David and Louise Turpin did not start as monsters. They started as an ordinary couple from rural America, and the distance between who they were and what they became is one of the most unsettling aspects of this entire story. David Allen Turpin was born in 1961 in Princeton, West Virginia. Small town, coal country, quiet as a child, studious. He went on to study computer engineering and built a career at Lockheed Martin and later at Northrop Grumman, two of the largest defense contractors in the United States. Louise Anna Robinette was born in 1961 in Vinton County, Ohio, the daughter of a Pentecostal preacher. Faith was not a part of her upbringing. It was the architecture of it. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. They met as teenagers. David was 19 when they married. Louise was 16 years old. They moved around. West Virginia, Texas, eventually California. They had children, one after another, 13 children over 26 years. Jennifer, the oldest, born in 1982. Jana, the youngest, born in 2010. 28 years between the oldest and the youngest. From the outside, the Turpin family looked eccentric, perhaps. Large, deeply religious, homeschooled. The kind of family that keeps to itself. David drove to work. Louise managed the home. The children were rarely seen. But the children were rarely seen for a reason. In the years before the arrests, the family had lived in several different places. In Fort Worth, Texas, they had occupied a house in a suburban neighborhood where former neighbors would later describe them as strange and withdrawn. The children were pale. The children were thin. The children never played outside. A neighbor who had knocked on the door once to introduce herself described the experience as deeply unsettling. Louise had answered, smiled, said everything was fine, and closed the door within 30 seconds. The children visible behind her had not moved, had not spoken, had stared at the stranger at the door with expressions the neighbor could not name, but never forgot. The family moved to California in 2010. They settled eventually in Perris, a city of about 80,000 people in Riverside County, inland from Los Angeles, the kind of place where the houses are spread out and the lots are large and nobody pays particular attention to what the family down the street is doing. They filed the homeschooling paperwork with the state. They kept the curtains drawn. They kept to themselves. And the years passed. What was happening inside that house had been happening for years before anyone knew to look. The Turpin children lived in conditions that investigators, seasoned law enforcement professionals who had spent careers processing the worst things human beings do to each other, would later describe as the most disturbing thing they had ever encountered. The children were starved. Not neglected. Starved. Deliberately, systematically, over years. They were fed once a day, sometimes less. David and Louise would buy food, sometimes large quantities of it, and keep it in the house where the children could see it and smell it. The children were not allowed to eat it. If a child ate food without permission, they were punished. Chained. The chains were not metaphorical. They were real chains, padlocks. the kind you buy at a hardware store. Children as young as 2 years old were chained to their beds, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. One child had been chained for so long that her wrists had developed wounds from the metal. She had learned to sleep in a position that minimized the pain. The house was dark. The curtains were always drawn. The children slept during the day and were awake at night, a schedule imposed by their parents that severed them from any contact with the outside world. They were not allowed to shower more than once a year. They were not allowed to play outside. They were not allowed to have friends. Many of them had never been to a doctor. Several had never been to a dentist. Their teeth were rotting in their mouths. The younger children did not know what a police officer was. They did not know what a hospital was. They had never been inside a grocery store. Several of them, despite being teenagers, had never learned to read. David and Louise called it homeschooling. There were notebooks. There were assignments. The props of education arranged carefully enough that if anyone ever looked, it would appear that learning was happening inside that house. Learning was not happening. Survival was happening. David and Louise Turpin were not poor. That is important to understand. At various points, David earned over $140,000 a year at Northrop Grumman. They owned property. They took vacations. They went to Las Vegas. They renewed their vows, repeatedly, elaborately, in themed ceremonies at Las Vegas chapels, dressed in costumes, photographed smiling, arms around each other in the gaudy light of a Vegas chapel, while an officiant pronounced them husband and wife for the 5th time, the 8th time, the 10th time. They posted the photographs on social media. Friends and acquaintances from their past left comments. How romantic. What a beautiful couple. You two are goals. While their children were chained to beds at home. This was not poverty forcing impossible choices. This was choice. Deliberate, sustained, systematic choice. David would bring home fast food for himself and Louise, while the children watched and were given nothing. He had an obsession with collecting memorabilia, WWE merchandise, Disney figurines, items that filled the house alongside the chains and the filth and the smell of malnourishment. Louise was the primary disciplinarian. She was the one who decided when a child was chained. She controlled the food. She controlled everything. David went to work. David came home. David was present in that house for everything that happened in it. He never intervened. Not once. Not in 26 years. The children referred to their parents as mom and dad, as children do. But the emotional reality of those words inside that house bore no resemblance to what those words are supposed to mean. Some of the older children had been in that house so long, had been so completely cut off from the outside world, that they had no frame of reference for what was being done to them. They did not know it was abuse. They did not have a word for it. They had nothing to compare it to. It was simply life. The only life they had ever known. And that, perhaps, is the detail that is hardest to sit with. Not the chains, not the starvation, but the fact that several of those children had never known anything else, and therefore had nothing to measure their suffering against. They did not know they were suffering. They knew only that they were hungry and cold and in pain, and that this was what existing felt like. Jordan Turpin, 17 years old in January 2018. She was the 6th of the 13 children. Her body, starved for most of her life, had not developed the way a 17-year-old's body should. She weighed 82 pounds. She looked, investigators would later say, like she was 10 years old. But inside that small, malnourished body was something that years of chains and darkness and starvation had not managed to extinguish. She had been planning her escape for 2 years. She and one of her sisters had attempted it once before and turned back, terrified. The world outside was unknown. They had been told that if they ever tried to leave, the consequences would be unthinkable. They believed it. They had been given no reason not to. But in January 2018, Jordan made a decision. She climbed out of the window. She ran down the street in the dark, clutching the deactivated cell phone, her bare feet on the cold pavement of a California suburb she barely recognized as a place where people lived. She found a house with a light on. She knocked. A woman named Kimberly Milligan opened the door. She looked at the girl standing on her porch, tiny, trembling, filthy. And she did not hesitate. She let her in. Jordan told her she had siblings at home who were being abused. She said her parents were not good people. She said she needed the police. At 6:07 in the morning, deputies from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department arrived at the house on Muir Woods Road and walked into something none of them would ever fully recover from. The first deputy encountered Louise Turpin. She told him the children were fine. She said Jordan was the troubled one, the difficult one. She smiled while she said it. The deputies moved through the house. What they found in those rooms, in that drawn curtain darkness, was 12 human beings in various states of severe physical deterioration. Several were so weak they could not stand. 2 were still chained to their beds. The older children looked decades younger than their actual ages. Jennifer, the oldest, was 29 years old. She weighed 82 pounds. She looked, medics estimated, between 10 and 12 years old. She was 29 years old and she had spent her entire adult life in that house. Some of the children did not want to leave. Conditioned by years of isolation and fear, several were terrified of the outside world. The deputies had to coax them out gently, explaining that it was safe, that the people in uniform were there to help. Several of the children had never seen a police officer before and did not know what one was. One of the younger children asked a deputy if he was an angel. He did not know what to say to that. All 13 children were transported to Riverside University Health System Medical Center. The medical teams who received them had been briefed on what to expect. They were not prepared. The levels of malnourishment, the vitamin deficiencies, the cognitive impacts of years of sensory deprivation, the physical damage from the chains. The medical staff would later describe the experience of treating those children as something that fundamentally changed their understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. David and Louise Turpin were arrested that same morning. 14 counts each. Torture, child abuse, false imprisonment. They were held on $9 million bail each. In the days that followed, the story broke across every news outlet in America and around the world. The Las Vegas vow renewal photographs surfaced. David and Louise in their costumes, smiling for the camera, holding hands in a chapel. Taken during the years when their children were chained at home. America looked at those photographs for a long time and tried to understand how the two things could exist in the same universe. Neighbors came forward. Some said they had never seen the children at all in the years the family had lived on Muir Woods Road. Others said they had occasionally glimpsed figures at the windows. One neighbor said she had tried to speak to the children once, and they had retreated inside immediately, as though contact with the outside world was something they had been trained to fear. They had been. Multiple people, across multiple years, across multiple states, had seen something that made them uneasy. A child too thin. A face too pale. A door that closed quickly. A family that never quite made sense. Nobody had called anyone. In February 2019, David and Louise Turpin pleaded guilty. There was no trial, no dramatic courtroom confrontation. They pleaded guilty and sat quietly while their children's victim statements were read aloud by an advocate, because most of those children were still too fragile to stand before a courtroom. One wrote that despite everything, she still loved her parents. One wrote that she had found God and forgiven them. One wrote that what had been done to her had not broken her, that she was going to build a life, that the world she had been kept away from was the world she was going to live in now. David Turpin was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Louise received the same sentence. The judge, who had presided over thousands of cases in a long career, told them that what they had done was among the most disturbing things he had ever encountered in all his years on the bench. He said it quietly, without drama, because the facts required no embellishment. In the years since the rescue, the story of what happened to the Turpin children has been complicated, and in some ways, nearly as troubling as the story of what happened to them before it. The 6 minor children were placed in foster care. Reports emerged in 2021 of serious failures, of children who had survived 13 years of abuse being placed in situations where their needs were not adequately understood or met. One of the minors reported being subjected to further abuse in a foster placement. The system that had failed to find them for so long continued, in some ways, to fail them after it finally did. The adult children were on their own, with no life skills, no education, no experience of the world, no money, no support network. Several of them were, by legal definition, adults. The law had no mechanism to care for them the way it cared for their younger siblings. They were 18, 19, 20 years old, and they were encountering the ordinary world: traffic, grocery stores, restaurants, strangers, sunlight, for what felt like the first time. Jordan Turpin eventually spoke publicly about her experience. She spoke about what it had taken to make that decision in January 2018, about the 2 years of planning, about turning back once and finding the courage to try again. She spoke about learning to drive for the first time, about walking into a restaurant and not knowing how to order, about the overwhelming, disorienting experience of a world she had been kept from her entire life suddenly opening up in every direction at once. She spoke about hope, about the future, about the life she was building piece by piece in the ordinary light of a world that had always been there, waiting for her. There are questions that linger around this case that no verdict can fully address. David Turpin had a security clearance. He worked for 2 of the largest defense contractors in America. He underwent background checks. And for years, while those checks were being run, his children were chained to beds at home. The school district had records for the children as homeschooled students. The Turpins filed the paperwork. Nobody followed up. Nobody verified that the children were healthy, that they existed as anything other than names on a form. 13 children were imprisoned in plain sight, on a residential street, in a house that from the outside looked like every other house on the block. For years, nobody came. Until a 17-year-old girl decided that the fear of the unknown was less terrifying than one more night inside. The youngest Turpin child was 2 years old when Jordan climbed through that window. The oldest was 29. What was taken from those 13 people is not something a sentence can restore. It is time. Specific, irreplaceable time. Childhoods, adolescences, the years when a human being learns who they are, and what the world is, and what they might become. Jordan Turpin climbed through a window in the dark and changed the course of 13 lives. She was 17 years old. She weighed 82 pounds. And she was braver than most people will ever have to be. What do you think? David and Louise Turpin will be eligible for parole in 2043. Should they ever be allowed to walk free? Leave your verdict in the comments below. Subscribe to Family Crimes for a new case every week, because the darkest secrets hide at home.